Let's break down 4 wide receivers and 4 running backs that I am currently trying to trade for in all of my dynasty leagues, whether I am a contender or I'm rebuilding as we enter the off season. So let's kick the video off with Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. And a big thing that I'm going to be looking for in terms of these players that we're going to talk about today, for the most part, is going to be players that are kind of coming off of a disappointing season, or maybe had, kind of a sour note to end the season. I think with Marvin Harrison Jr., there is kind of this overall disappointment factor. So you're going to have some members in some of your dynasty leagues that are going to be able to stay a little bit more put here and not necessarily give in, but then you're going to have a lot of dynasty managers who are also going to be super frustrated. And look at what Marvin Harrison Jr. did this past season as the wide receiver 32 in fantasy football, and the fact that he just barely averaged 11.2 fantasy points per game on the season. And then remember that they spent a ton of draft capital on Marvin Harrison Jr., whether it was in a rookie draft or a startup draft this past off season, and get a little bit frustrated and want to move on from him. But you guys have already heard me talk about this a bit going into some early content for the 2025 fantasy football season. I think that Marvin Harrison Jr. will be just fine. I've kind of made a loose comparison to what Jackson Smith and Jigba did in his rookie season compared to what he did in his sophomore season. And I do believe that Marvin Harrison Jr. can make a similar type of jump in his second overall season. It will be interesting to see what the Cardinals do this offseason in terms of their coaching staff. I don't think anything's going to change with Kyler Murray at quarterback, but maybe we get some switch up at offensive coordinator or something like that. But overall, I just believe that Marvin Harrison Jr. will be more productive in his sophomore season. It was a really frustrating season for Marvin Harrison Jr. In every game on the season where he scored a touchdown, except for one game, he had double-digit fantasy points. Week 17, no touchdown, but he had 15.6 fantasy points. Literally every other time he scored a touchdown, he had double-digit fantasy points. And outside of that Week 17 matchup against the Rams, he didn't score a touchdown in any of the other games, and those were the games where he had single-digit fantasy points. So he was extremely touchdown reliant this past year, and the Cardinals offense just did not end up supporting that on a regular basis. But like I said, you're going to have a lot of fantasy managers out there who feel a bit frustrated. The same thing happened last offseason with Jackson Smith and Jigba, where he went from being the top wide receiver in rookie drafts and in startup drafts, and then became this player that people were trying to trade for at a lower value or trade away at a lower value. So I think that we could see in some dynasty leagues this offseason a similar thing happen with Marvin Harrison Jr. And yeah, maybe he doesn't step right into being like a wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 for your team, but a lot of you guys are playing in 3 wide receiver formats and double flex formats. I think he'll be a viable flex option next year at worst. So at the right price, I'm looking to trade for Marvin Harrison Jr. as we get into the offseason. Next player I want to talk about is Marvin Mims of the Denver Broncos, coming off of a big performance in Week 18. And this is going to be something that we have to talk about in these type of videos, right? Is we're going to have some of these players, right, who are going into the playoffs, and recency bias is going to definitely impact these players when you're trying to trade for them or when you're trading them away. And I think you could easily argue a player like Marvin Mims, who has shown some flashes since like week 13 of the season in terms of like actually being consistent, maybe week 11 of the season, and is now going into the playoffs against the Bills by the time you guys watch this video. Maybe you should be trying to sell him high, but I think that Marvin Mims is a player that I would target as a good trade candidate, because I still don't think you're going to have to give up a ton of value for Marvin Mims. And I think he's a good player to add on to packages, because you still look at what he did on the season. He only averaged 6.7 fantasy points per game, right? We kind of break it down. Week 11, 13.3 fantasy points, scored a touchdown in that game, 19.9 fantasy points in week 13, scored a touchdown in that game. Then the final 2 weeks of the season, including week 18, so not the final 2 weeks of the fantasy season, but of the actual NFL season, he had 22.1 or more fantasy points, 30.2 fantasy points in week 17, and 2 touchdowns in each of those games. Now, played the Bengals defense in week 17. That was not an intimidating defense throughout the course of this past season. Then he played whatever the Chiefs were and their backups in week 18. So want to look at that as well. But the reason that I like Marvin Mims, especially, and like, you could argue this two different ways, but especially if he has a bad game in the wild card round against the Bills and like the Broncos don't advance to the divisional round, well, then I think that helps the recency bias and your ability to potentially trade for Marvin Mims at a better value. But if he has a big game in that matchup against the Bills, especially if the Broncos find a way to hold off and defeat the Bills, then we're looking at a little bit of a different scenario. So we'll find out as time goes on here. But if he does not end up having a big game, doesn't score a touchdown, then that is going to help you potentially trade for Marvin Mims at a better value. But once again, whether you're contending or you're in a rebuild, I think that Marvin Mims is in a good spot. Still a young wide receiver, hasn't really hit his stride in his career until right now. But what I like here is that he's definitely going to be a part of this offense next year. He looks right now to be the wide receiver 2 on paper. Of course, they could draft a wide receiver. They could trade for a wide receiver. Going to be a long off season. But this offense is moving in the right direction. You guys know, if you follow the channel throughout this past season, that we were fans of Bo Nix early on in the season. And Bo Nix, Sean Payton, this Broncos offense will continue to be productive into next year. So he's a good piece to have, because look at a player like Courtland Sutton, who I still like quite a bit. He's not really a player that fits the mold, whether you're rebuilding or you're contending, where Marvin Mims going into his 3rd season next year will be a player that kind of fits that mold for both styles of rosters, So Marvin Mims, Broncos offense, Sean Payton has his team moving in the right direction. Bo Nix looks great. Marvin Mims going to be another viable pass catching option for this offense next year. So whether I'm contending or rebuilding, I'm looking to trade for Marvin Mims. Next up, I want to talk about Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills. And this was an interesting one for me because I do like Khalil Shakir as well, and I do think he kind of fits the mold, like really regardless of what type of build you have, Khalil Shakir could be a factor that makes sense because he's only going into his 4th season next year. But I think that Keon Coleman showed us enough in his rookie season. Like, yes, it was very frustrating. He only played in 12 games, only averaged 8.8 fantasy points per game, but he still kind of had those big play moments. And he's another one of these wide receivers who, dependent on your rookie draft, on your startup draft, he maybe didn't go super early, but he had a lot of hype around him this past offseason going into the year because we were assuming with no Stephon Diggs, Keon Coleman would kind of step in. But this offense is very unique. Josh Allen does a lot of the work, does a lot of that work on the ground. James Cook does a ton of work at the running back position. Then in terms of wide receivers and pass catchers, like there was really no consistency outside of Khalil Shakir in terms of fantasy production on the season. But Keon Coleman is one of these players who, especially if he's not doing like a ton throughout the playoffs and however far the Bills go in the playoff run, right, then he's going to have a really perceived low value going into next season. So I think that he is one of these players that you're not going to have to give up a lot for. And once again, whether you are rebuilding or contending, he's one of these players who is very early into his career, showed us that big play capability, and will definitely have some sort of role with the Bills offense next season. And with that kind of perceived value potentially being lower, unless he just lights it up in the playoffs, you're not going to have to give up a ton for Keon Coleman. You're still going to have to give up some sort of value because he's still tied to Josh Allen and the Bills offense and all of that. But like I said, I think Khalil Shakir is close to this mold, but he's a little bit older. So I went with Keon Coleman. But like outside of these two guys, like you got Dalton Kincaid, who was very disappointing this past season. But outside of that, you don't have any true pass catchers on this team. I don't think Amari Cooper is going to be back. Curtis Samuel, Mac Hollins, like sure, everyone had moments on this roster, but I think Keon Coleman out of this bunch has the most upside very early into his career. And in the games this past season where he scored touchdowns and made big plays, he still gave you some sort of fantasy value. So I like Coleman as an option, whether we're rebuilding or we're contending going into next season. All right, last wide receiver I want to talk about is Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. And Xavier Worthy really became a player, who was a true league winner throughout fantasy football leagues this past year, right? Weeks 15 through 17, he had 19.6 or more fantasy points in each of those games and 2 touchdowns in that stretch, plus 9 or more targets in each of those games. And then we look at the Chiefs roster in terms of wide receivers, right? I mean, Hollywood Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster, DeAndre Hopkins, like we have a lot of up and down in terms of veteran-esque players here. And then we have Rashee Rice coming off of his injury. Obviously, Rashee Rice is going to have a role in this offense, but I think at worst, Xavier Worthy is still the wide receiver 2 on this team. Obviously, Kelsey gets some, sort of volume here, but is Kelsey going to be back next year? If he is back, how much volume is he actually going to get? Is Noah Gray going to step up the tight end position, get more volume? All that's up in the air. But once again, I think Xavier Worthy has a very solidified role in this offense and has really gained trust from Patrick Mahomes as the season progressed, similar to what Rashee Rice did in his rookie season, but not to the exact extent. But the other thing with Xavier Worthy is like he just has that nice boomer bust potential, a player that you can throw in at the flex on a weekly basis. And, if things get bad, like at least you have a chance with Xavier Worthy in there for some upside. So I do like Xavier Worthy quite a bit. Now, his perceived value is probably going to be a little bit higher, even though the Chiefs didn't play their starters in week 18 and they're on bye week right now. Depending on what the Chiefs do in the playoffs, Xavier Worthy keeps having this production. It might be a little bit more difficult to trade for him. But really, overall, I think that Xavier Worthy is a good trade piece. And then once again, you're going to have some fantasy managers who own Xavier Worthy who aren't as high on him because of Rashee Rice coming back next year. So that may help you in terms of trade negotiations, right? But it's going to be a little bit manager dependent there and league dependent there. But overall, I think he really fits that mold of like whether you're contending, whether you're rebuilding. Xavier Worthy has a ton of value when it comes to Dynasty right now. Still very young in his career, obviously, coming off of his rookie season. We'll see what he does throughout the playoffs. May impact his recency biasy. But overall, I like Xavier Worthy a lot as a top player to try and grab going into the offseason. All right, let's talk about a few running backs, and I want to start things off with Tyjae Spears of the Tennessee Titans. Now, Tyjae Spears was another player who ended up being kind of like a league winner, right? 13.3 or more fantasy points in each of the last 3 games of the fantasy season with a ceiling of 27.2 fantasy points and 4 touchdowns in that stretch, right? Now, when we look at the Titans offense, there's obviously a ton of question marks here. Who's the quarterback going to be? Is it going to be Kirk Cousins? Is it going to be somebody they draft? Who knows? The quarterback market's not great when we look at free agents going into next year. Are they going to keep trying with Will Levis? Really don't know. But regardless, that kind of creates a lower overall perceived value when it comes to the Titans offensive players. And I do think that Tony Pollard will have some sort of role in this offense next year. He was pretty dang productive this year. I mean, all things considered, he had over 1,000 rushing yards, had 5 rushing touchdowns, had 238 receiving yards, 57 targets, 41 receptions, was the RB21 in fantasy football. Like, it's not great. It's not league winning. It was a bit inconsistent as well, but he was still on paper, especially if you're not looking at it from a fantasy perspective, productive this year as a free agent signing. So I still think he'll have some sort of role, but we saw Tyjae Spears kind of come to life and what he can do for this offense, especially through the air as well, as he had 3 or more catches in each of those last 3 games on the season as well. And we saw like a little spurt of production very early in the season from Tyjae, but I think the biggest knock on Tyjae Spears is obviously going to be, can he stay healthy, right? And I still think that some fantasy managers, even in Dynasty, are going to have that concern because he ended the season with a concussion, right? And I talk about this a lot when it comes to trading, especially when we're looking at Dynasty assets, right? These kind of last-minute injuries, while they don't make you feel great to end the season, in terms of trading, it's very helpful because then that player, Tyjae Spears, for example, has a lower perceived value. So if you're trying to trade for them, it's a little bit easier because they're coming off of an injury. Even if it's just a concussion, even if they already gave you 13 fantasy points and they left the game due to a concussion, that perceived lower value can definitely still help you. So the Titans offense, definitely not in the best spot whatsoever going into next season. A little bit of an injury bug this year for Tyjae Spears, but the upside was certainly there. And I will note, I don't personally value running backs as high as wide receivers when it comes to Dynasty. I think everyone agrees with that, especially when we're playing full PPR, starting 3 wide receivers, having 2 flex spots, and the longevity of wide receivers, the contracts they have now in the NFL. Obviously, they hold more merit than quarterbacks. Most of you guys are playing in super flex, going to be way up there. Tight ends, it's always kind of back and forth. Like most of you guys are playing in tight end premium. And so you kind of value, some people value running backs over tight ends more. Some people value tight ends over running backs more. But this past season really showed us that there's a lot of value to the running back position, and we never quite know what we're going to get out of the NFL on a year-to-year basis. And running backs kind of made a resurgence this past year. So while I don't know if Tyjae Spears is necessarily the top value, I do want to start looking a little bit closer at some running backs who we can add as potential flex options, as depth options. And I definitely think that Tyjae Spears is a great player to try and target as we're moving into the offseason. Next up, let's take a look at Zach Charbonnet of the Seattle Seahawks. And this is a player who I really want to try and get added to a lot of my rosters this off season. We saw Charbonnet really be able to shine as a starting running back for the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, he had double digits every time he was the starter on the season, except for week 18 against the Rams. Really, that game script ended up with the Seahawks needing to throw the football a ton, right? But Charbonnet had a ton of production, was able to fill in for Kenneth Walker very nicely. We know that the Seahawks have gone out and fired their offensive coordinator, so hopefully we can get an even better Seahawks offense going into this coming season. And Zach Charbonnet, just don't forget, for a lot of people, coming out of his draft class, was the RB3 or 4, depending on how you looked at it, how you had your rankings. Some people even the RB2, and is still a player who has a ton of great skill sets and can make a dent in the receiving game as well. But kind of the bigger point here, I mean, we all know what Zach Charbonnet is, right? But the bigger point is that Kenneth Walker just cannot seem to stay healthy on a yearly basis. And it's just really difficult to take a look at a player like Kenneth Walker and really break down what his overall longevity is going to be in the league. Like, he'll probably be fine. We see a lot of running backs deal with injuries off and on early in their career, but he just continues to be more and more disappointing. And this season was the most disappointing as he finished as the RB25 in fantasy. And, you know, the previous season, he at least had 1,000 total yards from scrimmage, even though he finished under 1,000 rushing yards. But this past season, did not do so, didn't even touch 1,000 yards from scrimmage, and only played in 11 games, where in the previous 2 seasons, he had played in 15 total games. So I still think Walker will have some sort of relevancy in the Seahawks offense, but ultimately, I think that Charbonnet is going to continue to get plenty of opportunities, and even potentially increased opportunities this coming seasons. So I like Charbonnet quite a bit right now. I think he's a good depth piece. Doesn't matter if you're rebuilding or contending. I think he's a player who could bring a lot of value and is a player that you don't have to give up a ton of assets for when you guys are trading. All right, next up, let's take a look at Chase Brown. And once again, this is a player I don't care if you're rebuilding. I don't care if you're contending. Chase Brown is a player that I'm trying to trade for in all formats. And this is a good example of, like, yes, it sucks that he ended the season on a bad note, on an injury, not having a ton of points against Denver in week 17. But in terms of trading, this is a good thing because he ended the season on a bit of a sour note. Now, like, Chase Brown's going to be fine week 1 of the 2025 season. We all know that, but sometimes this perceived value can help you guys when you're trying to trade. And Chase Brown went on an absolute tear this past year from weeks 4 through week 17, double digits in every single game except for 1. He had over 13 fantasy points in all those games except for 4, finishing as the RB12 on the season and averaging 15.9 fantasy points per game. So, yeah, there's going to be a little bit of a shakeup when it comes to the Bengals in the offseason. Is T. Higgins going to be on this team or not? They need help on the offensive line. They need help on the defense. Joe Burrow is going to be there. Jamar Chase is going to get his contract. Will the coaching staff get shaken up? We'll find out, but nonetheless, right now, this is your clear-cut RB1 going into next year. Now, of course, they could sign a free agent. They could trade for someone. They may draft a running back. They need depth on this team desperately, the running back position. So they will add somebody, but Chase Brown, I think, will continue to separate himself from whatever other running back is on this team. It is worth noting that in week 18, even against a good run defense like Khalil Herbert, was pretty productive as the RB1, and he got all the touches. So I mean, it feels like right now the Bengals kind of like the idea of having a bell cow running back and kind of riding one running back, but you just never know what's going to happen in the offseason. So Chase Brown, I still think, is going to have a massive role in the Bengals offense next season. So he is a player really regardless of if I'm rebuilding, of if I'm contending, that I want pieces of. If you guys can go out and trade for him, I would absolutely do so. All right, and last but not least, I want to take a look at Tyrone Tracy of the New York Giants. And this is another player, right? I mean, we have no idea what the Giants are going to look like going into next year. We know that, their head coach and their coaching staff is staying put here, but are they going to draft a quarterback? Are they going to trade for a quarterback? It's all up in the air here, right? And it's kind of hard to break down exactly what this offense is going to look like, but we know that Malik Neighbor is going to be the wide receiver 1, and I think that we know that Tyrone Tracy is going to be the RB1 as well. Of course, we'll see as the offseason progresses. Things can always get shaken up here. Always draft another running back. They can always trade for one, sign a free agent, all that stuff. And I don't actually know off the top of my head, which I probably should for the point of this discussion, if Devin Singletary's under contract through next year or not. But I really believe that Tyrone Tracy did enough to separate himself from whoever they bring in, whoever's on this depth chart going into next season. Of course, it depends if there's like a stud rookie on this team or whatever, but I think that Tyrone Tracy will be, going into next year, the clear-cut RB1 here for the Giants. And he averaged 10.9 fantasy points per game, finishes the RB27, and still gave you plenty of double-digit performances. We look from weeks 5 through week 17 of the season, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 total double-digit performances. You can't really count the first 4 games of the season against Tyrone Tracy. So I really think when we look at this offense next year, it's going to be Tracy, it's going to be Neighbors, and that's what they're going to kind of formulate their offensive attack around. So he's another player the last week of the season wasn't great. Really, the playoffs weren't great. 4.5 fantasy points in week 15 against Baltimore, was good against the Falcons, was 16.9 fantasy points in week 16. Then in week 17, whatever happened against the Colts happened for the entirety of the Giants. And even though the Giants and Drew Lock were pretty dang good that week, Tyrone Tracy just didn't end up being very necessary because Drew Lock threw for 309 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns, and Tracy only had 9.3 fantasy points. But once again, that kind of lower perceived value will help you guys when you are trading. Plus, the Giants are kind of up in the air in terms of what this offense is going to exactly be next season. So I think that Tracy, really regardless of what your build is going into the 2025 season, is a great asset to go ahead and trade for as we're preparing for our Dynasty rosters. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 4 wide receivers and 4 running backs that I am trying to trade for in Dynasty leagues, whether I am rebuilding or contending heading in to 2025. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, moving into the 2025 fantasy football season, Dynasty or non-Dynasty, whatever it may be, let me know. I'll get back to you guys when I can. And of course, if you guys are new to the channel, this is what we do all year round: redraft, Dynasty, and best ball content. If you guys are into that, be sure that you guys hit that subscribe button on the way out. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.